Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Jason Josephson-Storm, Chair and Associate Professor of Religion at Williams College. Josephson-Storm's research interests include East Asian religions and philosophy, European intellectual history, and theories of religion, philosophy, and sociology. His first book, The Invention of Religion in Japan, was published in 2012. More recently, The Myth of Disenchantment, Magic, Modernity, and the Birth of Human Sciences was published in 2017. Forthcoming is Absolute Disruption, The Future of Theory After Postmodernism. Josephson-Storm gave a talk based on the myth of disenchantment at the UO on May 3rd, 2018, as a guest of the Department of Religious Studies. Thanks, Jason, for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure. It's great. Great to be here.
So first, let's take you back in your career and begin with what led to your interest in East Asian religion and philosophy.
There's a long story there. So both of my parents are philosophers, and I grew up kind of hearing about Kant. I can't remember a point in my life when I didn't know who Kant was, which is kind of crazy. But my parents came out of the philosophy departments in the 1960s, and they were interested already in Asian philosophy and thought. And so they were part of a Zen practice community, and I grew up sort of meditating with a bunch of folk there. And so already from a young age, I was interested in philosophy and in a lot of the forms of philosophy associated with East Asia, particularly Chinese and Japanese philosophy. And when I had gone as an undergraduate to study those things, the mainstream philosophy departments didn't think they counted as philosophy. So then that pushed me more into the religion department, where we could talk about Chuang-Tzu or whatever. And at that moment also, I got really introduced to continental philosophy, which also was another exiled discipline from the philosophy department and very different than the analytic philosophy my father did. So I just kind of got drawn into those two worlds kind of in parallel. Yeah.
So just give us a kind of snapshot of the first book, The Invention of Religion in Japan.
Sure. So The Invention of Religion in Japan is about Japanese intellectuals encountering the term religion for the first time and trying to figure out how to translate it, trying to figure out what, if anything, in Japan counted as a religion, and then noting that the term religion was often paired with, in contrasting ways, with some kind of notion of science or some kind of notion of superstition or secular statecraft. So what that book does is it's a long history of the Japanese transnational encounter, both looking at in the first part of the book from the 1850s to the 1910 or so, looking at translation debates and Japanese attempts to figure out whether they could guarantee freedom of religion and what freedom of religion was supposed to be. And then I did a backstory where I looked at an early Jesuit encounter in the so-called Jesuit century, and I look at how they understood Christianity without a term for religion in place. And that I sort of called a heretical anthropology, because I read anthropologists on both sides of the colonial encounter. So I was able to read Portuguese writings about Japan in the same moment to read Japanese writings about the Portuguese, and I was really interested in the kinds of miscommunications or different conceptual categories, the various players in that kind of moment. So that became my first book. Yeah.
So how did you get from The Invention of Religion in Japan to doing your second book on European intellectual history? How did you get there?
So I always from the beginning, I was very interested in the period and in sort of questions rather than in geographies. And I had been trained to do 1600 to the present in Japan, but in a broad international context. And it was pretty easy in a way intellectually to make that shift. But concretely what happened was I was in Japan doing research in 2011 for what I thought was going to be my second book. And I say a little bit in the intro to this, but just to take a long story short, I happened to be there when the Fukushima incident happened, when the Tohoku earthquake happened. And I was in Kyoto, which was very far away from the catastrophe itself, but it made it impossible for me to go to the archive I'd been planning to go to in Tokyo to do additional research on that. And I had a conversation with some random folk, basically, about the project I was working on then, which was about contemporary Japanese beliefs in talismans and ghosts, and sort of I was interested in the hybridities between technology and, for lack of a better word, magic in contemporary Japan. And when I was explaining the project to a Western interlocutor, he said basically, oh, but Asia is mystical or something. And I really bothered me, and because he claimed that those kind of beliefs didn't exist in the West, but I wondered if that was truly the case. And so I found myself in Germany instead of Japan, in part because I found some funding there. And so I ended up kind of trying to ask this question about magical belief, basically, in European history, sort of, there instead.
So tell the story about your grandmother.
Yeah, so part of the reason that I knew that the West wasn't disenchanted is that my grandmother, Felicitas Goodman, was a very famous anthropologist. One of her books, the exorcism of Emily Rose, or the possession of Emily Michel became the film, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and she had spent a lot of time studying Pentecostal communities in Mexico and what have you. And in her old age, she had, so to speak, gone native. She had moved to the Poaque Reservation in New Mexico, and she had started participating in local ceremonies and then come to believe that there really were spirits. And growing up, my parents would often send me to my grandmother's for the summer because my parents were trying to do their academic research, and my grandmother was there. And grandmother's an amazing woman, probably the single biggest influence on my intellectual trajectory. And during the summers, she would have people come to these workshops, famous academics in some cases, scholars from Mexico, from Germany, and from the United States, and they would talk about ghosts and things like that. And I never quite bought into the ghost picture, but I found the whole environment richly fascinating. And so I knew, or I had the hunch that a lot of people were like my grandmother. A lot of them, even if they didn't admit it, because a lot of the people who came to these things, in their publications, they never mentioned spirits or ghosts, but on the reservation, they would talk about them as if they believed in them. And I got a sense that that was not atypical, that my grandmother wasn't exceptional in that particular way. She was more exceptional in the fact that after she retired, she was open about it, whereas a lot of other of her contemporaries weren't. So that gave me the sense that the narratives about disenchantment that we've been telling ourselves at least didn't apply in certain areas. And in particular, I was suspicious of a claim I heard repeated frequently that the human sciences, the humanities and social sciences, were themselves disenchanting or vectors of secularization. What I saw instead was the way that anthropologists gave birth to new religious phenomena, studies of shamanism that transformed themselves into neo-shamanic movements, like, for example, Carlos Castaneda, who famously got a PhD in anthropology from UCLA. And so, I mean, that is not atypical, and I suspected that there was a longer history of that kind of pattern. Yeah.
So give us the major claims of the book. So you did this research, and tell us what you found.
So in the Myth of Disenchantment, so basically, to take a step back and give you the broader argument, one of the most frequent narratives that we tell ourselves about modernity is that as a people becomes more modern or more modernized, they abandon belief in myths, spirits, and magic. Often this defining feature of modernity is often presented as disenchantment. Disenchantment is the thing that signals modern thought. At least that's the narrative, and it's supposed to apply to Western Europe, if not the rest of the world. But it turns out, if you look at contemporary sociological data of the present in America or Great Britain or Germany, it looks like something like 60 to 70% of Americans believe in paranormal phenomena. I don't remember that exact percentage. I'll have to check, but it's roughly comparable in countries that are also much more secularized than the United States, according to conventional measures. So in the United States, 90% of people believe in God, but a lot of people believe in ghosts. In Britain, maybe 30% of people believe in God, but 37% of people believe in ghosts. For example, the Daily Mail ran something with the title, "More Britons Believe in Ghosts Than God." And I mean, they sensationalize it, but this pattern continues to hold insofar as there is extensive belief in the supernatural and ghosts and astrology, psychic powers, or what have you, throughout what is supposed to be the heartland of modernity and the heartland of disenchantment. So in the first chapter, I survey that sociological data, and I do a little bit of mini ethnographic stuff around coffee shops where I live, which are covered with flyers on crystal healing and what have you. And then I decided to look at the longer history of that, because the question became for me, well, if contemporary America and Europe are not disenchanted, how do we get the narrative that they were disenchanted? And then I discovered that narrative had been articulated particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, often mostly in Germany, but in Germany, Britain, and France. And that created even more of a problem, because that's a period of time in which there's a massive spiritualist movement. People are doing seances and table turning. There's also a number of very outspoken occult movements of the period, the Order of the Golden Dawn, for example, or later Aleister Crowley, etc. So it's a period in which it's overflowing with belief in spirits and magic. So how did that period, and in the very countries where those traditions were most influential, come up with a story that the central feature of modernity is disenchantment? So I set out to answer that. I went through the archive. In terms of my research, I did archival work in Germany, France, Austria, Britain, and some stuff in the United States. And I went through diaries and letters, and what I was interested in were the lives of the theorists of disenchantment themselves, and where, for lack of a better word, I'll call the occult milieu, intruded into their lives. And I found a lot more interesting things about their beliefs, some of which were public and some of which they didn't admit to, but you could find in diaries and letters and writings. And in so doing, I kind of end up doing a grand trajectory of the birth of the modern human sciences and how they reacted to this sort of enchanted milieu in one way or another. Yeah.
So, the disenchantment of modernity is a myth.
Yeah.
and you looked at these foundational figures, and you also put them next to these foundational figures of Western occultism.
Yeah.
And then there are much broader implications from your story. So one of the implications concerns how we understand modernity. And in your account, our understanding of modernity is also mythological. So tell us about that.
That's right. I mean, one of the things that was really motivating the project is I was interested in this notion of modernity as rupture. So often modernity is described as a disconnect from other modes of thought. Either modernity is supposed to be the moment that we suddenly achieved reason, or in a negative mode, the moment we suddenly became inauthentic, or and those narratives of modernity as rupture began to bother me, and in particular because many of the things that were described as the so-called ruptures of modernity is so vague. It's a vague category. People peg it to a whole range of different periods. They define it in 1,000 different ways. Often they seem to make the actor the very thing trying to be explained. So when they're talking about why are coffee shops this way, people like modernity or whatever, why is the internet this way, modernity. So it seems like that's turning a periodization into some kind of motor or engine of history. And that I don't believe. I think there's a lot of counter evidence for it. And in particular, the narrative of modernity, particularly modernity bundles together all these different processes in the ordinary language. I'm not arguing against industrialization or against changing literacy rates or anything like that, but often those things are integrated in a way that to me seems analytically suspect. And then in particular, there's a narrative of modernity as this end of myth or as disenchantment that I think is false. And so because of that, what I became interested in is how different discipline founders developed a language to talk about modernity, how they began to see themselves as exhibiting a rupture. So, and it's true in different disciplines. So for example, in sociology, with Auguste Comte starts to think of a rupture between industrial society or modern society and preceding more traditional societies, becomes a sociological rupture. In psychoanalysis, it became a psychological rupture. Freud begins to think about whether modern thinking is different than primitive thinking, for example. We could keep going through the disciplines, but all of them tend to internalize some notion of a rupture, and often that rupture was tied to a notion of European uniqueness that I think is also artificial. So they were describing it as both a geographical category and a temporal category, and I think all of that bundled together became a kind of pervasive myth. And the other piece of it, and so it leads me to some of my later targets, I want to argue that the notion of postmodernity relies on a sort of discredited notion of modernity, or a notion of modernity that it's parasitic upon, that it's granting the assumptions of, even as it's criticizing them. But it's all very sloppy and messy. For example, the figures who we think of as the canonical founders of postmodernism, let's say, famously Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, are often considered the founding figures of postmodernity. And so those same figures, I mean, the movements are blurred together. And in our contemporary political moment, we think of an opposition between Enlightenment and postmodernity. And both of those, as I'll argue, are kind of mythical creations, both insofar as that period had very different valences than we kind of back project onto it, and insofar as this notion of some kind of radically different form of thought that started, I don't know, in the 60s, 70s, or with Nietzsche, doesn't turn out to be as radically different as one might imagine. So in a way, what I'm trying to pull down are both those two kinds of ways of periodizing and looking at history.
So in addition to this intervention of sort of demythologizing modernity, demythologizing the myth of disenchantment, the work also has implications for how we understand, or how we ought to be understanding, about the human sciences and the humanities going forward. So say a little bit about that part.
So, I mean, I have a lot I could say about that. Let me think what cross-section to give you. I mean, so let me...
Well, look, I direct a humanities center. So I'm particularly interested in the humanities side of it.
So there are a bunch of interesting things that I think are there, that I think are implications of this. And some of those are implications that are explicitly in this book, and some of them are in the book that I'm working on right now. So some things that probably won't surprise you. The disciplinary silos, the way that the different humanities and social sciences are divided up, are arbitrary and incredibly artificial. They're based in assumptions that you can disaggregate different kinds of human phenomena in a way that is really, it's anachronistic, it's a product of a particular history, and it's built around kind of anxieties that around differences or notions of modernity that don't hold. So part of the work, as you commented before we started talking, it's quite interdisciplinary, and I'm looking at all these different disciplines because they're really shared habits of thought. They're ways in which that they they really interpenetrate, and there's a lot of territorialism that causes them to appear different, and the production of specialized vocabulary, but often saying the same thing in just in their own disciplinary idioms. So one move that I'm trying to do is push those together. Second, another implication is that the humanities and social sciences have produced feedback on the areas that they purport to study. So sociologists here, and had this insight first, and I'm kind of expanding on it, but people like Bourdieu and Anthony Giddens and company have started talking about reflexive sociology. So basically, like, a society that has sociologists in it is a very particular kind of society. So once sociologists give you a survey, it changes your way of inhabiting the world. Or once sociologists start making government policy, it changes the social order. The very thing that they purport to study is transformed, and it's a feedback loop in some ways, producing self-perpetuating patterns, and in some cases undermining attempts at prediction, for example, in sociology. In this book, I focus on religious studies in particular, and I show how religious studies has had its own kind of feedback loops on the things that it is purporting to analyze, how religious studies gives birth to new religious movements, and how new religious movements impact the kinds of things we think of as disciplinary objects in religious studies. So and I don't think we should fight that. I don't think that's a bad thing, and in fact, it's in some ways answers to some of the crisis of consciousness that we've had in the disciplines, and I think inward looking and reflexivity, I mean, I'm not the first to say this, but it's a powerful tool. One of the things that we cultivate in the humanities is a kind of proper reflexivity. So those are some of the implications. I mean, other things that I'm beginning to work toward in the next project also are that one of the ways in which the humanities and social sciences are often seen as different from the natural sciences turns out not to be true. There's a myth of modern of natural sciences, which is based on a scientific method that people don't actually pursue in most disciplines. It's based on a notion of physics that doesn't fit biology, that doesn't fit astronomy, that doesn't really fit math. Which isn't to say that it's bunk or anything like that, but rather a lot of what happens in the sciences is basically pattern matching, and then sometimes predictive explanation based on pattern matching, or sort of methodological tools or techniques for further kinds of pattern discovery. And if you think about it that way, the human sciences, or the humanities and social sciences, sorry, I got excited, I was going a little fast there, start to look a lot like the natural sciences. In particular, there's a way in which the kind of work that we do in religious studies, in English departments, etc., is similar to what happens in biology departments. It's similar to what happens in zoology departments, etc. So there's a way in which I think that these, we've artificially, especially in the English-speaking world, differentiated the humanities off from everything else, whereas in point of fact, the modes of thought are in many ways very compatible. So there's in German, a Wissenschaft includes, the term that's often translated as science, includes any kind of systematic knowledge, and I think that's a better category than our notion of the only thing that counts as science is something, the prestige natural sciences. Mm-hmm. So in part, that's the other implication. And I'll add one last one, and then I'll stop here. But another thing that I'm working on in the new project is we have a notion that in the humanities and social sciences we're supposed to be working for value freedom, or working toward value neutrality, or that we're somehow supposed to embody it in our disciplines. I think it was a well-intentioned move when people like Max Weber proposed it in Germany in the early 20th century, but we've misunderstood that and have blown it out of proportion. We've made the assumption that value neutrality means that you're not supposed to have any values in the humanities, but actually our language is richly value-laden. The very language that we use both as scholars and as ordinary people that talk about our work in sociology or in religious studies or in English, that necessarily is value-laden. It necessarily has values built into it. But because we think we're supposed to be value-neutral, what we end up doing is attacking things that are positively held values, but allowing our value criticism to run rampant. So we're masters of critique and the hermeneutics of suspicion, but we've become very bad in the last few decades at actually sticking up for the values that we believe in. And in fact, that means we often admit the very thing that we're most passionate about in terms of our research. So one of the implications of this book, but I'm amplifying in the next project, is I want to allow people encourage people to bring their values to the surface, to think about the kind of things that they're doing. And I think bringing them to the surface allows us to discuss them and debate them. And I don't think it's bad. And I think embracing value neutrality as a value itself, which sounds like a contradiction, but what I think it means also is more just an openness to other people having different values than us. And I think what Max Weber and company wanted was just you wouldn't fire somebody from a sociology department because they voted for a different political party. And I think that's good. We don't want to fire, but that doesn't mean you have to hide or even should suppress the things that make your research important. So in this respect, I think of the humanities as, and I'll give you this last little bit on here, as we should, instead of thinking of the humanities as just the subject that studies humans, I personally think we should imagine the humanities as disciplines that help make us better humans. So, and I've tie into some stuff in virtue ethics and some other, contemporary debates around that.
Okay, so this other project that you've gestured toward a couple of times, Absolute Disruption, the Future of Theory After Postmodernism. So one of the things, in one of your posts, you talked about a post-mortem on postmodernism. So one of the numerous things that you're interested in pursuing in this second book, in this third book, Absolute Disruption, is that these formerly de rigueur movements collected under various terms, deconstruction, post-structuralism, French theory, postmodernism, have collapsed and lost their influence. So you've begun to explain why. What led to this collapse?
Yeah, so to give you another little autobiographical moment, so I'm part of the generation that got deconstruction before we got structuralism, before we got whatever was supposed to be modernity. So from my perspective, I grew up with the counter-hegemonic disciplines, and I think that they're incredibly valuable. I spent a bunch of time, I went to Paris to go to see Derrida lecture and, spent 2 years living in Paris trying to attend lectures of whoever was trendy at that particular moment. And I find that work incredibly valuable. But that said, there are certain kinds of impasses that it encountered. And in particular, we could talk about a bunch of different ways to understand those, but what happened was in the United States, we took a bunch of competing types of skepticism or different kinds of philosophical enterprises, people who didn't agree with each other, who didn't get along with each other, who thought themselves doing totally different projects, and we bundled them together, sometimes under the name French theory, sometimes under the name post-structuralism, and then more polemically under the term postmodernism, and then sometimes we stuck in art styles and architecture and what have you. The first observation is that the art and architecture that we labeled postmodern is mostly stuff from the 70s, maybe up through the 90s. Nobody's doing postmodern architecture anymore. So, as a periodization, we've moved beyond it. The things that, for example, Frederick Jameson talks about famously in his analysis of postmodernism, all of that we would now think of as, almost all that we think of as passé. So we've moved beyond that moment in that sense. And in terms of our scholarship, what we've done, unfortunately, I think that there are maybe three competing trends. On the one hand, there are people who, what they learned from post-structuralism was a kind of poetry that became a kind of acting like, sort of, instead of dealing with the real philosophical issues that I think are powerful and important that Derrida and Foucault and company brought up, a lot of people just adopted their style. And so there became a lot of superficial theory literature that wasn't very good. A backlash against that has become a kind of real particularism, which is even worse, the anti-theory movement, and that's in part what I'm pushing against. In religious studies, people decided they didn't need theory, they were just historians. They just looked at archives or whatever, but what all that meant is that their own theoretical commitments were unexamined and that they were often re-entrenching these very naive categories. And then lately, there's been a backlash of people who want to return toward enlightenment as some kind of universal. I don't think either of those three options is going to get us very far. I think the particularism causes balkanization and fragmentation in the disciplines, and we can't read each other's work. It leads toward a hyper-specialized world in which most of the work is irrelevant, but is just more paper. A lot of the post-structuralist wordplay stuff doesn't get us anywhere too because it hasn't really extensively developed or worked out the right philosophical issues. And then the call toward enlightenment in a naive sense toward a world of facts without criticizing or understanding the complexities that are involved in the genesis of the modern fact, to borrow a phrase from the philosopher of science Fleck, Ludwig Fleck, that isn't going to work either because it's a straw man. We're producing straw man facts that are too easy to knock down. So the question then becomes, if all those three current threads aren't working, what ways could we have to move forward? And the argument that I put forward in that book is a way to move past postmodernism by radicalizing it. In a way, granting some of its critical conclusions, but taking them in a way either further or causing them to reorient ourselves on that thinking. To give an example from Hegel, people talk about the Hegelian dialectic in the wrong way. They attribute a dialectic that's more like Schelling to Hegel, and they say it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's not what Hegel argued. A better summary of Hegel's dialectic is a limited abstraction followed by a negation, followed by a negation of a negation. And what's interesting to me is not that Hegel's a master theorist. I use him only for one very short chapter, but I think it's a very important move. Hegel is very interested in the way that certain kinds of philosophy can move in the face of skepticism. And I think that's what the interesting thing about the dialectic is. He's reacting to Hume's reaction to Kant's reaction to Hume. And what the negation of the negation is sometimes understood as, a bunch of different ways. There's a long debate in Hegel scholars. I think of it as a pivot on the foundations of the original claim while leaving certain contradictions unresolved. So, for example, I think that what Hegel has in mind is Kant's reading of Hume, in which Kant takes the very things that Hume thought were the sources of skepticism about our capacity to fully know the modern world, for empirical knowledge to fully know of the world or understand the depths of causation, etc. And then Kant says, let's grant those, but then he locates those in the noumena famously, right? So he wants to say, let's move forward while granting some of the skepticism. So what I want to do is, what I'm doing in that project is disaggregating, let's say, postmodernism, for lack of a better term, into three areas. One, a crisis of ethics, of which I think we don't actually have a crisis of ethics the way we thought we did. As I've said, I think a call toward a new kind of discussion of value is the answer to that. Second, a kind of issue around general skepticism. That's an easier one to solve. I'm not the first to say this, but in most of analytic philosophy in the most recent periods, people have become fallibilists. They've granted the limitedness of knowledge. They maybe they overweight what they're capable of in terms of knowledge. They may not fully internalize a lot of skepticism, but I think we can grant a kind of fallibilistic knowledge and move forward. And then third, what I want to do is bring to bear a set of new techniques for studying intellectual categories in the process of transformation and decay. I'll give you one example. In religious studies, we have gotten very, very worried about the term religion itself. We've shown that it has a particular European history and trajectory. It includes a binary opposition between the religious and the secular, which it can't sustain. Things are always crossing or collapsing that binary. And we've learned, in effect, that the way that category, it's hollow. It's a messy category. What we don't know in religious studies is that many other disciplines have undergone similar crises. So, for example, in art history, there was an extensive challenge to the notion of art already in the 1950s. Religious studies, we think we're innovating this, but it was like 20 years later. We can talk about the concept of culture under critique in certain sectors of anthropology, or a fight in the 90s about the category of society and sociology. All these intellectual master categories fall apart. They break down. In part, I'm going to argue because they're humankinds, and there's a confusion about humankinds and natural kinds. And the way that we segregate the social or the humanities and the social sciences doesn't work, as I was telling you earlier, to circle back to our conversation. So the disciplines have divided up a heterogeneous space full of accident, but also full of these unfolding, what I think of them as kind of unfolding processes. I'd have to say a little bit more about why I call them processes. And because we've assumed that they're natural kinds, that they naturally divide up human experience, we constantly are able to show that that doesn't actually map onto human experience. Art is a messy category, it's historically conditioned, etc. But we think we're deepening our knowledge of art. What we're actually doing is coming to get ourselves entangled in a particular historical trajectory. So what I want to do is to take a step back beyond those categories. Admittedly, this is itself a category that will be later subject to critique, but that's okay. And I've been talking about these, and my formulation for it isn't perfect, but high entropic processes or high entropic assemblages. And I'm borrowing something from information theory about the nature of complex thought. And I want to look at how we can talk about them in particularity, and how we can begin to sort of to think of ourselves within a certain kind of conceptual horizon. So what it does is it brings up a lot of issues around translation, around comparison, around even what we think of as human kinds versus natural kinds. And what I think I'm able to show, what I'm hoping I'm able to show, and this is the part I'm writing now, so I'm the most sort of fuzzy about it, but I think it gives us a new way to think about our toolkit as scholars, particularly as sort of humanities and social science folk moving forward, inhabiting conceptual things that we don't want to throw out, but we also want to both we want to explode them, but strategically and in the right way, to kind of see what they're hiding, but also allow them to do certain kinds of conceptual work. They fit certain kinds of patterns, and we have certain ways of understanding, and what we're really doing is looking for kinds of patterns. So what we want to be able to do is kind of deepen our knowledge of those in a historically conditioned way.
Okay, amazing.
Sorry, that was too fast.
Thank you for everything you've shared with us. We've just blown through this time. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. It was really interesting.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Sorry I rambled there at the end.
No problem. I've been speaking with Jason Josephson-Storm, Chair and Associate Professor of Religion at Williams College. Josephson-Storm gave a talk based on the myth of disenchantment, magic, modernity, and the birth of the human sciences at U of O on May 3rd, 2018 as a guest of the Department of Religious Studies. Thanks again for watching.